It didn't build up. There was no warning, no slow transformation, no visible climb. Just overnight. And that's the part they can't process. Because yesterday, they were still comfortable with you, still speaking over you, still measuring you with outdated assumptions like nothing had changed. But something had. Quietly. Precisely. Without permission. And now, they're replaying every interaction, trying to locate the moment they missed it. They won't find it. Because you didn't announce it. You didn't signal growth. You didn't perform evolution the way they expected. You removed noise. That's all. The unnecessary reactions, the explanations, the need to be understood. Gone. And in that silence, something else took its place. Something they don't have language for. That's why their tone shifted before their thoughts caught up. Why their eyes pause half a second longer now. Why conversations with you feel uneven. Like they're standing on ground that used to be stable, but isn't anymore. They keep asking themselves the same question, just in different forms. What changed? But the real question, the one they avoid, is worse. When did we lose control of how we saw them? Because it's not just that you changed. It's that their version of you stopped working. Completely. And now they're stuck in that gap. Between who they were sure you were, and what you've become overnight. No transition. No explanation. No access. Just a shift so clean, it feels unnatural. And that's what unsettles them the most. Not your silence. Not your distance. But the precision of it. Because people understand chaos. They understand breakdowns. They understand emotional reactions. But this looks intentional. Controlled. Final. And deep down, without saying it out loud, they've already started adjusting around you. Carefully. Cautiously. Like they're afraid of triggering something they don't fully understand anymore. Because whatever happened overnight wasn't visible while it was happening. Which means it might have been building for a long time. And if that's true, then they were never as aware of you as they thought. They were confident about you. Not curious, not cautious. Confident. That's what made it easy. They thought they understood your limits. Where you would hesitate. Where you would explain yourself. Where you would shrink just enough to keep things comfortable. And you let them believe it. Not by agreeing, but by not correcting them. That was their first mistake. They mistook your restraint for weakness. Your silence for confusion. Your patience for permission. So they got comfortable doing what people always do. When they think they figured someone out. They simplified you. Put you into a version that made sense to them. A version that stayed predictable, manageable, safe. They spoke to you a certain way. Looked at you a certain way. Expected reactions on cue. And for a long time, they got them. Or at least they thought they did. Because what they never realized was this. You weren't reacting the way they believed. You were observing. Measuring tone. Timing. Intent. Not emotionally, but precisely. Like someone studying patterns they already knew would repeat. And they did repeat. Again and again and again. Until there was nothing left to guess. That's the part they missed completely. They thought time was on their side. That familiarity meant control. But time was never working for them. It was working for you. Every assumption they made, you cataloged. Every underestimation, you let pass. Every moment they thought they had you figured out, you let it stand. Because correcting them early would have ruined the accuracy of what you were seeing. And accuracy mattered more than being understood. So they kept talking. Kept assuming. Kept placing you into smaller and smaller definitions. Never realizing those definitions were becoming outdated. In real time. That's why this feels sudden to them now. Why it feels like something snapped overnight. Because in their version of reality, nothing was changing. You were still the same, still readable, still predictable, still within reach, but their version wasn't real. It was delayed, out of sync with who you had already become, long before they noticed. And now, they're stuck trying to reconcile two versions of you that don't match. The one they were sure of, and the one standing in front of them now. Unfamiliar, controlled, and completely outside their expectations. Which leaves them with something they don't handle well. Uncertainty. Because if they were this wrong about you, then what else did they completely misread? While they were getting comfortable with their version of you, you were already leaving it behind. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. The shift didn't start overnight. That's just when it became visible. What they're reacting to now is the result of something they never paid attention to. Because it didn't demand attention. It was subtle. Small decisions. Quiet refusals. Moments where you chose not to respond. Not because you didn't have something to say, but because you saw no value in saying it. That's where it began. You started filtering. Not people. Patterns. The repeated tone. The predictable disrespect disguised as familiarity. The way conversations always tilted in the same direction. You noticed. And once you noticed, you couldn't unsee it. That's the part they'll never understand. They think change requires emotion. A breaking point. Some visible trigger. But this wasn't emotional. It was calculated. You didn't explode. You didn't confront. You didn't announce a shift. You reduced access. Piece by piece. Less reaction, less availability, less explanation. Not to punish them, but to see what remained when you stopped feeding the dynamic. And what remained was revealing. Because without your effort, without your adjustments, without your silent corrections, everything stayed exactly the same. They didn't evolve with you. They repeated themselves. That's when it became clear. The gap wasn't temporary. It was structural. And once you saw that, you stopped trying to bridge it. That decision didn't look dramatic from the outside. No arguments. No final conversations. Just a quiet withdrawal. So precise. It went unnoticed while it was happening. Until it was complete. That's why it feels like it happened overnight. Because they only felt the absence. Once it was already permanent. They didn't see the process. They didn't feel the distance growing. They didn't realize that every time you stayed silent, you weren't holding back, you were moving on. And now they're left staring at a version of you that no longer operates the way they expect. No emotional openings, no predictable responses, no access to the version of you they were used to managing. Just presence, controlled, measured, and completely self-contained, which forces them to confront something they were never prepared for. This wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. And decisions like that don't reverse themselves. It wasn't a moment. That's what they keep getting wrong. They're searching for a scene, a sentence, a fight, a breaking point they can point to and say, that's when it happened. But there was no scene. Just a line that you stopped crossing. Quietly. No announcement, no warning. One day, the things you used to tolerate just didn't pass through you anymore. Same words, same tone, same behavior. Different result, no reaction. That's when everything shifted. Not for you, for them. Because people don't notice growth when it's internal. They notice it when their control stops working. And suddenly, their usual ways of reaching you didn't reach. Their tone didn't move you. Their expectations didn't pull you back into position. Their assumptions didn't land. It was like speaking into a space that no longer responded the same way. That's when the discomfort started. Subtle at first. A pause where there used to be certainty. A hesitation before speaking to you. A second glance just to check if they still had you figured out. They didn't. And you didn't correct them. You let that confusion sit. Because for the first time, you weren't interested in being understood. You were interested in being unchanged. That's the difference they couldn't adjust to. Before, they could shift your mood, influence your response, shape the interaction just enough to stay in control. Now, nothing moved you unless you allowed it. And you rarely did. Not out of resistance, but because most of it simply didn't qualify anymore. That's when they felt it. Not as a realization, but as a loss. Something subtle had been removed from their reach. Something they didn't even know they were relying on. Your availability, your reactions, your willingness to engage at their level. Gone. Replaced by something colder, more precise. A version of you that doesn't push back, but doesn't bend either. And that's what unsettles them the most. Because resistance they understand. They know how to deal with arguments, emotions, confrontation. But this is different. There's nothing to fight, nothing to fix, nothing to pull back into place. Just a quiet, unshakable shift. That refuses to explain itself. And now they're left standing in front of you. Testing small things. Watching closely. Trying to see if the old version is still there somewhere. It isn't. And the more they test it, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't mood. This wasn't distance. This was a recalibration. Permanent. Which leaves them with a realization. They're not ready to say out loud. They didn't lose you suddenly. They lost access to you. The moment you stopped needing them to see you correctly. At first, they tried to ignore it. Pretend nothing had changed. Speak to you the same way. Use the same tone, the same timing, the same subtle pressures that used to work. But something kept failing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. And that's what started to break them. Because failure without explanation is harder to process than resistance. If you had argued, they could have adjusted. If you had reacted, they could have measured it. If you had pushed back, they could have pushed harder. But you didn't. You gave them nothing to work with. No emotional openings, no visible frustration, no sign that anything they were doing mattered. And that's where the instability began. Slow at first. They started replaying interactions in their head, going over conversations that used to feel normal, now trying to find where the disconnect started. They couldn't find it, so they tried something else. Testing. Small comments. Subtle provocations. Slight shifts in tone designed to pull a reaction out of you. Anything to confirm that the version of you they knew was still there. It wasn't. And every failed attempt tightened something inside them. Because now it wasn't about control anymore. It was about uncertainty. They couldn't read you. And people rely more on predictability than they're willing to admit. You remove that completely. Now every interaction with you feels unstable, unmeasured, off balance. They don't know what affects you. They don't know what reaches you. They don't even know what you see anymore. And that lack of clarity turns inward. Doubt replaces confidence. Overthinking replaces instinct. They start questioning themselves. Did I say something wrong? Did something happen? Why does this feel different? But the deeper question, the one they avoid, is this. Why can't I get a reaction anymore? Because that's what they were used to. Not you. Your responses. And without those responses, they lose their reference point, their influence, their position. That's when it shifts from confusion to discomfort. Because now they're not just unsure about you. They're unsure about themselves around you. And that's where the real collapse begins. Quiet, internal, invisible to everyone else, but constant. They start adjusting how they speak to you, watching themselves more carefully, choosing words they never had to think about before. Not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. Because when someone becomes unreadable, they become unpredictable, and unpredictability feels like risk. So now they approach you differently, more cautious, more measured. Not because you demanded it, but because something in your silence forced it. And the worst part? They still don't understand what changed. They just know that whatever it was, they weren't part of it. Which leaves them in a position they've never had to face with you before. On the outside, watching, trying to figure out how someone they once felt certain about became something they can't even interpret anymore. And the more they try to understand it, the more it exposes something they didn't expect. This isn't confusion, it's loss. You noticed it. Not their confusion. That came later. You noticed the exact moment. Nothing in you moved anymore. Same environment, same people, same patterns playing out with almost perfect repetition. But inside you, silence. Not forced, not controlled. Natural. That's when you understood something most people never reach. Detachment isn't distance, it's clarity. You didn't step away because you were hurt. You stepped away because you saw. Fully. Accurately. Without needing to interpret or soften what was in front of you. And once you see something clearly, you don't negotiate with it anymore. That's what changed. You stopped negotiating. Not out loud. Not in some dramatic declaration. Internally. You stopped justifying behavior that required explanation. Stopped entertaining dynamics that depended on your reaction to survive. Stopped participating in patterns that repeated without evolution. You didn't close doors. You removed yourself from rooms where doors didn't matter. And the shift was immediate. Not visible, but absolute. Because when you detach like that, you don't feel the urge to return. There's no pull, no unfinished tension, no internal dialogue asking what if. Just stillness. Clean. Final. That's why your silence feels different now. Before it had weight. Emotion behind it. Something unresolved beneath the surface. It's empty. Not in a hollow way. In a complete way. There's nothing left in it that belongs to them. No need to respond. No need to prove. No need to correct how you're perceived. Because perception lost its value. The moment you stopped depending on it. That's the part they can't reach. They can sense the distance. They can feel the shift. But they can't access the reason. Because the reason doesn't involve them anymore. And that's where your evolution becomes irreversible. You didn't become colder. You became selective, precise, unmoved by anything that doesn't align. And once that line is drawn, even silently, it doesn't blur again. Which means something they haven't fully accepted yet. They're not waiting for you to come back. They're standing in a place you've already outgrown. They still think this is about timing, about when you'll return to normal, when you'll soften again. When the version of you they understood will resurface, like nothing happened. But nothing is resurfacing, because there's nowhere left to return from. What they're calling change is actually completion. You didn't become different in pieces. You became whole, in a way that removes the need for their interpretation entirely. And that's what makes you unreadable now. Not mystery. Not attitude, finality. You stopped orbiting people who required constant explanation just to respect you. Stop shrinking yourself into roles that were easy for others to digest. Stopped performing familiarity just to keep others comfortable. And in doing that, you became something they can't position anymore. That's why their thoughts keep looping. Not because they miss you, but because their mental version of you no longer matches anything real. Every attempt to figure you out now feels like chasing a moving target that doesn't respond to being chased. Because it isn't moving. It has already arrived somewhere they don't have access to. And the most uncomfortable truth for them is this: you didn't rise in reaction to them. You rose in silence around them. They were not part of the transformation, not the trigger, not the witness, not even the reference point. Just background noise you eventually stopped adjusting for. And now that they realize it, they start to understand the real distance. Not physical, not emotional, structural. The kind of distance that doesn't close with time. Because what separated you wasn't conflict, it was awareness. You saw enough to stop participating. And once someone stops participating in the version of reality others depend on, they don't become a memory. They become an example of what happens when silence stops being weakness and starts becoming identity. So now, when they look at you, they're not looking at who you were. They're trying to decode what they lost access to. But there's nothing to decode anymore. Only this: you didn't disappear overnight. You simply stopped being available to be understood on their terms. And that's where the story ends for them, but begins at a level they can't follow.